and the slave traders took him down to Egypt, and Joseph started out in Egypt as a slave. And this is just going to be my kind of Cliff Notes version of this. So if you want to get into that deeper, I definitely encourage you to do that. But in the Cliff Note version, he was sold into slavery, and he ended up a servant of an official in Egypt, and through a series of events, got to the point where he was second in charge in the land of Egypt. He was second in charge only to Pharaoh. So he had a great deal of power and authority in Egypt. And during a time of famine in this entire region, Jacob and his family and his sons found themselves without food. They were going through this famine, and they went to Egypt to get this food, to find food, to find some place where they could get food so that they could survive. And they end up down in Egypt and find out that Joseph is still alive. They thought he was dead. Find out that Joseph's still alive. And through another series of events, they begin to settle in the land of Goshen in Egypt. It's like the fat of the land. It's called, they said it was a good land so that they could settle and begin to put down roots and begin to grow as a family. And I love the fact that when they came down, and we're going to see this as we travel through Exodus, so I want to throw this out right up front, because one of the things that I see in the book of Exodus, they kind of go in as a family. It talks about them as a household, or a family. They go in as a family and come out as a nation. And I want us to start to keep that in the back of our minds as we go through this, how they begin to grow, how they begin to see that promise fulfilled, see that covenant that God made with Abraham so many generations before, how that comes into fruition, it begins to gel, they become a nation, they grow, and they become more powerful. And there's a lot of things that are going to happen that we're going to read about as we look at Exodus. But that's how that's where we find ourselves as we look at the book of Exodus. And then what I also want us to note is that as we enter into Exodus, Joseph has died. At the end of Genesis, Joseph dies. So this power and authority that Joseph had in the land of Egypt begins to wane. And the power and authority and maybe some of the favor that Jacob's family had in the land of Egypt begins to wane as well. And this is kind of where we find ourselves in the book of Exodus. So let's start to read. Before we do that, I just want to pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, I just bless you and thank you for your word. And Lord, I pray that you would use your word to challenge us, that you would use your word to grow us, Lord, that you would use your word to create a stability in our lives, Father God, a foundation from which we can grow, from which we can build, Lord God. Lord, I pray for your blessing as we read your word. Open our hearts, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so let's get into the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, these are the names of the sons of Israel. Israel is a name that God gave to Jacob, so he kind of changed his name to Israel. So we're still talking about the same people here. These are the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So as we start out here, we see that as we stated, Joseph died, and that generation died. So Joseph and his brothers died. They passed on, and there's some discrepancy as to whether this is a few years or a few generations, but there's some time that's passed, and this new king, this Pharaoh, begins to rise up in Egypt, and he's forgotten about Joseph. So they've lost their favor. There really is no kind of buffer between Pharaoh now and the descendants of Jacob. But something happens, and we're going to see this thing happen several times as we read these first few verses here, these first couple or chapter and a half. And it says that the descendants of Jacob grew strong. They grew in number and they grew in strength. It uses words like the land was filled with them, it says in verse 7. It says they multiplied, and it says they grew exceedingly strong. So I want us to keep that in mind. I want us to keep it in mind that they come in as a family. They come in as 70 people. It says they came down from this land of Canaan where they were coming to seek food. There were 70 people. And I want us to understand that when they leave as millions. When they leave Egypt, they leave as millions. So God's doing something. I want us to keep that on our mind and take a look at what God is doing in this story. So with that in mind, I want our first takeaway to be this. I want us to understand that we should not despise small beginnings. Jacob and his sons came down to Egypt. They didn't have food. They were 70 people in all. There were a bunch of brothers and their families. 70 people in all came down. So they end up in this foreign land, which was a land apart from where the promise was given. The promise was that they were going to step into the land of Canaan. And they kind of left the land of Canaan to go down to Egypt to find food and to find themselves in a foreign land. So there was this small beginning. But I want us to understand that God can do something in us by starting small. Sometimes we get frustrated and we get to the point where it's just it's distasteful to us. It's so small. It's like something that God can't be in this. It's too small. But the thing is, God can do great things, and it may start with a kernel. It may start, the seed that gets put in the ground is so small, but man, those things can grow so big. An oak tree, I believe that's an example that we see in the Bible, that an oak tree grows so big, but it starts as such a small kernel. Don't despise small beginnings. When God does something, when he begins to do something in your life, it may be small, it may start small, and it may not look like much. But I want you to understand that if we hold on to faith in him, to understand that he can bring something big about from something small, something so small. Let's not despise small beginnings. They started as 70, they went to millions. They started as a family, and they came out a nation. Let's remember that. Next, let's move on to verse 8. And we're going to see what Pharaoh was going to do about all this happening, the growth of Israel within his land. In verse 8 it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." So we see, as I mentioned, this new king, this Pharaoh rises up in the land of Egypt. The favor is gone from Israel, and he begins to look at the nation of Israel or the family beginning, maybe this budding nation, begins to look at them and determines, hey, we got a problem. We got a problem here. And the problem is that the nation of Israel, even though they're in this foreign land, even though they are probably a minority in that land, Pharaoh looks at them and says, hey, they're growing in strength here. And I see trouble on the horizon if we let this growth, if we let this strength continue unchecked. So he comes up with a plan A. And we're going to see several plans, and we're going to see several times how it's going to be mentioned. This is the second time, actually, where we see that Israel is continuing to grow. So no matter what happens, then Israel continues to grow. So Pharaoh comes up with plan A, and his plan A is, hey, I'm going to put them under a regime of slavery. I'm going to put taskmasters over them. I'm going to make them do work for us. I'm going to make them build cities for us. It says that they did work with mortar and brick and in the field. So they put them to work, and it says that they were harshly treated. That was his plan A. He says, if I can just do that, I'm sure in his mind he's saying, if I can do that, we're gonna take care of this problem. They're never going to become big enough to join with our enemies and defeat us and overthrow us. So I got this in hand. Plan A, we put taskmasters over them. But what happened? It says the Israelites multiplied. It says they spread abroad. And it says the Egyptians were in dread of the Israelites. Can you imagine that? Even this smaller group of people, they begin to see that there is something different in them, that there is something different in everything that they do to them. Whether they're in a foreign land or whether they put them under harsh slavery, they begin to grow. They continue to grow. They continue to get stronger. I want us to stop here, and I want us to take something else away from this. One of the things that I can see in this that is so important, I think, both here and really in the rest of Exodus, is that God can build us in adversity. I think that is amazing, because I think that if you are like me, you don't like to go through adversity. That is something that I really despise doing, is going through. If there's one thing I despise doing, is going through adversity. It's going through troubles and struggles and strains. It's not a fun thing. But how many of us, when we look at the adversity, we all have stories of adversity. We all have stories of struggle in our lives. How many of us can look at those struggles, look back at them, or maybe look at them right now that you're going through them? How many of us can look at those things and look at it in a positive sense? It's easy to look at it in a negative sense. It's easy to look at a struggle and say, that is horrendous, that is terrible. I hate being in it, I hate that I had to go through it. It's easy to do that. It's easy to look at it negatively. But I want us to begin to look at the struggles that we go through in a different light. I want us to be able to understand that the things that we go through are things that so many times God brought us through. So many times God built something on the inside of us because of the adversity that we faced. There are positive things that come out of adversity, and things that we need to learn, things that we need to grow in, and things that are going to happen in our lives that wouldn't happen any other way besides adversity. I think I might have mentioned this before, but in my own life, this was some years ago, probably, 15, 20 years ago even. I kind of went through a period in my life for quite a few years, actually, probably 10 or 15 years, where I was having some health struggles. I was having struggles with my stomach, and I was getting to the point where I was losing weight, and not really in a good way. Some people would always tell me, like, "Oh, that's great. I can't believe it. I wish I could lose weight," but it wasn't in a good way. It was a time in my life where I was struggling. It was a time in my life where that was affecting the way I lived. It was affecting my. I had no energy. I was losing weight. I was going through a time where I couldn't even go out with friends sometimes. I just had no energy, and it was a struggle, and it was adversity, and it was something that I despised. I hated going through it. It hurt. It didn't feel good. And when I was going through it, if God told me He could have taken me out of it the next day, I would have grabbed at it. It was something that was just distasteful. But I look back at that time, and I look back at what God did in my life because of that. I look back at the spiritual growth. There was spiritual growth in my life because of that struggle, because of that thing. And there was a spiritual growth that happened that would not have happened in any other way than me going through that. I couldn't have been taught that. I couldn't have learned that in a book. It was a struggle. It was a bare knuckle brawl. And God created something, though, in me. He didn't destroy me because of it. He made me because of it. There was a spiritual growth. There was a renewed prayer life. I was praying not to check off a box. I was praying to get out of a situation that I thought was leading to nothing other than death. I thought there was a situation in my life, and I was praying not just to pray 2 sentences of prayer each day. I was praying to live. I was praying with a desperation. I was praying with something that was so deep on the inside of me, and it created that in me. It made that happen. It made that grow in me. It made that, it renewed a prayer life, and it built a prayer life in me, that adversity. There was a resilience that was created in me because of that. I learned that I could go through things that I never thought I could go through. I never thought I could go through that. If you had put that situation before me before that, I would have said, I can't do that. I can't do that. But what does that do then, now that I have 20/20 hindsight and I can look back? It tells me that no matter what gets thrown my way, I can deal with it. I can handle it. God can bring me through that. Adversity did this. God, walking through, adversity didn't do it, but walking through that adversity with God did it. He created something in me. I learned the importance of godly friendships. I was so amazed at how people came up alongside of me and tried to support me in that. You know, not that and the power of friendship, of godly friendship and godly relationships, how I would have never made it through without that. And then just practical things like just a healthier life, learning how to eat well, learning how to exercise and sleep well and do those things, just practical things that I would have never gotten without adversity. So God can build us in adversity. Let's look at verse 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. Third time we see that. They continue to multiply even in this adversity. And because, verse 21, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So here we see plan B and plan C. So Pharaoh sees that the Israelites continue to grow in strength, they continue to grow in number, and he continues to be afraid of them. He continues to fear them and believe that is a problem in his nation. It's a problem in his country, that this group of people are going to overthrow him. So his plan B is to go to the midwives. The midwives are a group of ladies that help pregnant women give birth. It helped them through that process of giving birth. They didn't just go to the hospital back in ancient Egypt. They had midwives to help these ladies through this time of birth. And he told them, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go to these ladies, and when they give birth to a son, you're going to kill that son. And when they give birth to a daughter, you're going to let the daughter live. But the midwives didn't do it. They defied the king's edict. They defied Pharaoh's order, and they let the sons live. And they kind of told a little bit of a lie there. They said, hey, it just happens too quick. By the time we get there, the children are gone. You know, they're already, they've been taken, they've been birthed and already gone. So it's like, we just can't do anything. Sorry, Pharaoh. So these ladies, though, these ladies were blessed because of it, because they took, really, if you think about it, they took their lives in their own hands. It was great personal risk to themselves not to do this, to defy this king who we know had no problem killing people. He's just telling them to kill the sons of the Hebrew women. He has no problem with that. So what do they think he's going to do if Pharaoh finds out that they're lying to him? They took great personal risk. but God blessed them for it. They acted in faith, not fear. They didn't fear man. They feared God. They acted in great faith at great personal risk to themselves. And God blessed them for that. It says God blessed the midwives. It says that he gave them families. And I looked at that, and I think sometimes we neglect to see the beauty and the blessing that there is in a family, particularly in our day and age. I mean, I think we take that lightly, and I think in this time there was such a weight to that blessing. It meant that he gave them a stability. There was a stability in their lives. There was a stability in their support group and those around them. There was a social standing. There was an increased social standing with that. Quite possibly the midwives, being as they were serving others, they may not have had a family themselves. They may not have had kids. The ability to have a family gave them an increased social standing. There was a security in that. Their kids could take care of them. You guys remember this. Kids can take care of them when they get older. There's a security in that, and there's a legacy in that. He blessed them with a legacy. He blessed them. Their legacy and the things that they were imparting to the next generation were going to continue on. There was something fulfilling about what God blessed them with. So that was plan B. He says he's going to go and have the midwives take care of this situation. And then in the last sentence there we see plan C. And plan C is that he went to all the Egyptians and he said, throw them into the Nile. If you find a son, throw them into the Nile River. We're going to take care of them that way. So that's plan C. He is just kind of growing in fear and growing in his edicts here, in the severity of his edicts, to try to make sure that he's going to limit what's going to happen in the future, this problem that he sees on the horizon. He's trying to limit his risk. And just as an aside here, as I looked at that, I'm wondering, so why did the male children, why were they killed and the female children let to live? And most everything that I read kind of pointed to the same thing. And basically, it was that the sons were going to create a future military and political risk to Pharaoh. They were going to be the ones that were going to rise up and fight him and join possibly with another enemy of Egypt and fight Egypt. So he was limiting his risk there, but he was continuing by letting the female children live. He would have continued to supplement his slave labor force, because they would be able to kind of continue on somewhat with that generation, so that there would be some slave labor. So he's trying to limit his risk, and he's trying to make sure that the benefits that he was going to get from it were still there. So Pharaoh was trying to be shrewd in what he did. He was trying to be shrewd in the things that he did. But we're going to see it still didn't go too well for him as we continue on. The third takeaway I want for us here is that detours don't mean the death of your vision. Detours don't mean the death of your vision. And the reason I say that is this. Think of where Israel is. They're so far away from this Abrahamic covenant. They're in a place, they're in a land that's not their own. They didn't have food. Now they're under taskmasters. Now they're trying to be killed. They weren't in a good situation. They took a pretty massive detour from this promise that God had given them, had given to their ancestors generations before. This thing that they passed down from generation to generation, from father to son, and down and down and down. And they get this, and they're holding on to this promise. But it sure looks like a detour to me. It sure looks like they're so far away from where God had for them. I think that many of us sometimes find ourselves on detours, find ourselves in places that seem so far away from who we thought we were going to be. That we find ourselves so far away from the promises that we felt that God had for us at the beginning. I know that that's so easy to become discouraged there. But I also know, and like I mentioned at the beginning, like we sometimes let go so easily of a promise of God because we get into these places of detours. We get into these places that when we kind of come up for air for a second and we look around us and we say, this is nowhere, I am so far away. God must have left me because I am so far away from what he promised me at the beginning. I'm so far away from the land of Canaan. That's where they were. And really no hopes of getting back there. How possibly can God accomplish his purposes and his promise in my life when I'm so far away from where he said I was going to be? I love how the Israelites held on. I love how they never let go. They walked in faith. They walked in faith. They walked in faith. Even in the midst of being so far away from where they thought they should be. How many of us are there in those detour situations in our lives? How many of us have broken family relationships? How many of us have those broken relationships and we think we are so far away? This is not what God promised me. This is not what I got into this whole thing for. I didn't get into it for this. I didn't get into it for this. We have broken relationships. We've lost purpose in our lives. There's lack of fulfillment in our lives. There's so many things happening in our lives that we feel like we're just so far away. There's just this detour after detour after detour. And that's probably where the Israelites thought that they were and found themselves to be. Detour after detour. But they continued on in faith. They trusted God. They passed down from generation to generation the word of the Lord to their nation, to their family. They continue to speak those things to their children. And they saw the culmination. I want us to keep this in the back of our mind because we're going to see that there's a culmination to this promise. There is a fulfillment of this promise. If we will just hold on, if we will just trust in God, trust in his word to us. Just because we are on a detour doesn't mean that the vision that we have for our lives that God's given us is dead. Doesn't mean that. Keep holding on. Let's finish off in Exodus 2, 1-10. And we're going to look at the birth of Moses. So we're kind of seeing these two things. We're kind of seeing the birth of this nation in fulfillment of that promise. We're seeing the birth of this nation, and we're going to see the birth of one of the great leaders of this nation here. And they're both coming out of a place of struggle. In verse 1, chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And she saw that he was a fine child. She hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done with him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant women, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the girl went and called the child's mother and Pharaoh's daughter and said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him." Verse 10, "When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" A lot of he's and she's in that, I think. So let's try to just go through that. So basically, this is the birth of Moses, and he comes at the time when Pharaoh was trying to kill all the children, all the male children of the Hebrew women. So Moses was slated to be killed. If what Pharaoh so desired happened, he was going to be killed. And we see how Moses' mom, again, just like the midwives, defied the edict of the king. because this edict was going to kill her son. And so she hid him in this basket and floated it in the Nile River. And we see how Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, finds this basket floating in the river with Moses, and saves him and pulls him out of the river. And in the end, Moses' mom gets to kind of raise, at least for the first portion of his life, begins to raise him and even get paid for that, it sounds like. She's getting her wages, it says. So there's a blessing from God, not only because Moses, not only because the midwives were defying the king's edict, but also Moses' mom defied the king's edict in order to save this child, in order to save Moses. And she was blessed for that. I think that's an amazing thing, and I want us to see in this one last takeaway as we close out, and that is that faith leads to victory. I believe that faith leads to victory. And I think that this is one of the big ideas, one of the big things that we're going to see in pretty much all of the book of Exodus, that faith, walking in faith, continuing on with that vision, continuing on, holding on to the promise of God leads to a place of the fulfillment of that promise. There is a victory in that. When we hold on to the things that God has given us, there is a victory. And I want us to see that. I want to kind of contrast two things. I want to contrast Pharaoh's fear, and I want to contrast the faith of the midwives and of Moses' mom. When we see Pharaoh, we see him acting in fear. Everything he did was in fear. He feared the rise of the Israelites. He feared that. He felt that it was going to overthrow or take away his power. And we see that kind of grow, and everything that he did was out of that fear, and he kind of escalated his decision making every time he looked at that problem. He just became more and more afraid. There was a fear in him, and in the end, how did that work out for him? We see that we haven't seen it yet, but I'm just going to give you a little foreshadowing. He lost a whole bunch of his army. He lost the Israelites anyways, and he lost his own son. He lost his own son out of this. He continued to act in fear. He was acting as an enemy of God and not as somebody who came up alongside of God and was following God. That's what we see out of Pharaoh. But we see out of the midwives and out of Moses' mom, we see this amazing ability to work with the plan of God and to begin to pour into this plan of redemption that God had. And we see that the midwives were blessed. We see that they were blessed with families. We see that Moses' mom was blessed because she saved her son. Not only did she save just her son, but she saved one of the great leaders that was going to be there to bring Israel to a place of deliverance, to deliver them, to bring them out of this place that they found themselves in Egypt. There's blessing in this. As we just kind of finish off, and I can have Fred come up, but I just want to. There was one story that I read that I thought was kind of indicative of this. That faith, and that I think kind of wraps this chapter and a half up as faith. In faith, there's victory. I read a story, and you probably, if you have seen the movie Chariots of Fire, you'll know this story of Eric Liddell. He was an Olympic runner, and Chariots of Fire, that movie was written about Eric Liddell's life. And he was an Olympic runner in 1924, and he was favored to win the 100-meter dash in 1924 in that Olympics. And he decided that he was a Christian man, and the heats, the qualifying heats for that race were supposed to be on a Sunday. So he decided that he wasn't going to do that. He had a conviction that he wasn't going to run on the Lord's Sabbath. That was his conviction. And he did that out of faith. He did it out of a place of faith, out of a place of standing against something kind of creeping into his life to pull him away from faith. So he decided that he wasn't going to do that. So he wasn't able to run this race that he was supposed to run, and he was supposed to win, and it was supposed to give him a gold medal and give him all fame and fortune that comes along with that. Instead, he decided that he was going to run in the 400-meter race. And this was not, he was not favored in this, and that was not his race. It wasn't a race that he had run often at all, but it was a race that he could run that didn't run on Sunday, and it didn't conflict with his convictions about that. And we see in the end of the race that he won the 400-meter race. He won that gold medal anyways. And I think that is such a testament to the blessing of God when we act in faith. When we act in faith, there is victory. When we act in faith, there is received promise when we act in faith. When we begin to live our lives in such a way that we don't fear that adversity, but we continue on in faith, God blesses that. And I would say this too. I would say that we are not qualified or able even to apprehend the promise that God has made to us if we're not willing to learn the lessons that we need to learn as we walk through that struggle, through that adversity. He's preparing us. The things that we go through are things that God's using to prepare us to step into the land. When they got into the land of Canaan, when they got into the promised land, they didn't just walk in there and take over. They had to fight. They had to fight to take that land. But they were prepared because of the struggles, because of the adversity. God prepared them and made them well able to take the land. Amen.